From the Evening Standard newsroom in London, I'm Mark Blunden and this is the Standard Podcast. Coming up on today's show,
the lowdown is drinks, canapes, gossip.
London's hottest and poshest summer parties. Can we blag an invite? But first, Rishi Sunak sought to put his D-Day debacle behind him and refocus the general election campaign on policy with the Conservative manifesto launch.
We are the party of Margaret Thatcher and Nigel Lawson, a party unlike Labour that believes in sound money. We will ensure that we have lower welfare so that we can deliver lower taxes.
Today, the PM was at Silverstone Grand Prix track with a smorgasbord of pre-ballot pledges. So what's on the menu, what's new and what's costed? Now we're joined by Evening Standard political editor Nicholas Cecil. Nick, what were the headline manifesto announcements?
Rishi Sunak launched the Tory manifesto today, and it was very much tax, and tax. He announced, first of all, that the main rate of national insurance would be cut by a further 2p by 2027. So that would mean that this rate has effectively been halved from 12% to 6%. And then there was a surprise announcement, which was the complete abolition of the main rate of self-employed national insurance during the next Parliament if the Tories are re-elected. Overall, Mr Sunak announced a £17 billion tax-cutting package, which includes changes to child benefit, the pensioners' triple lock plus, and moves to help people get onto the property ladder. But there are really two big questions that remain. The first is, how is he going to pay for this? So the Tories claim that they can save £12 billion through reforms to the welfare system and a further £5 billion through closing what's called the tax gap, i.e. clamping down on tax avoidance. Now, these are big figures, and independent experts question whether they'll actually be able to achieve these sums. The second big question is the country still listening to Tories? If you look at the polls haven't changed. Labour remains very much 20 points or so ahead, and around 2/3 of the country say they believe it's time for change. So Mr Sunak really needs a game changer, and we'll see in the next few days whether his big tax announcements will make any difference.
What do we know about the Conservatives' manifesto costings?
They make bold pledges, and when you actually look at the detail and how they go funding it all, there are often questions to be asked. Labour is insisting that all its policies are properly funded. And again, independent experts are really saying two things. One is they're questioning the funding mechanisms for both parties, and they're also pointing out that after the election, there's going to be some very tight spending situations, and the public finances will be very, very restricted, and that both parties, whoever is in power, may well have to cut some unprotected departments. So yes, while there may be more money for the NHS, things like local councils, the court system, there might be some spending cuts, which might be very painful.
What more can you tell us about the help for first-time buyers, and how much of a splash do you think the Tory manifesto will have made with voters?
Mr Sunak announced that stamp duty would be ditched for first-time buyers when they're buying a home up to £425,000. There's also a new and improved Help to Buy scheme to help people get onto the property ladder. The Prime Minister was trying to recall the spirit of Macmillan and Thatcher as he unveiled these measures, trying to portray his party as a party of aspiration and of lower taxation. Again, is the country listening? There are lots of promises today, but it's whether this is washing over voters or whether they're truly taking it in. Many of them won't actually properly pay attention to what the parties are offering till far closer to election day, polling day on July the 4th. So all the parties will now be going out, trying to ram home their messages. And as voters switch onto the election in the last week or so before July the 4th, then there could be some shift in the polls. But at the moment, it's certainly looking quite a struggle for the Conservatives.
And aside from policy, what about the leaders' personalities? What info have you gleaned from polling?
The Evening Standard has had an exclusive poll done by Ipsos, and that basically asked voters what was the most important thing for them, the individual parties, their policies, or their leaders. And for this election, the leaders scored comparatively low compared to previous elections. And this was largely down to a fall in the score for the Conservatives. Now, this may not all be down to Mrs. Sunak personally, but I suspect it's more to do with some of his predecessors, including Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, and the controversies over their premierships. So voters, certainly at the moment, are saying they're putting more emphasis on the policies of parties and the parties themselves than on the leaders at this election.
Let's go to the ads coming up. Stay tuned for a glimpse inside the capital's most exclusive summer parties and pro tips for successful mingling with ES Diary editor Ethan Croft. Why not hit follow? In the meantime, give us a rating. Welcome back. Now we're out in the relative summer sunshine with the Evening Standard's diary editor Ethan Croft, who with reporter Claudia Cockrell have been scouring their contacts books to compile a guide of the season's hottest, poshest and most exclusive London parties across art, fashion and politics. And Ethan joins me now for a glimpse behind the velvet rope. Ethan, where's hot this summer and who's splurging the cash to host?
Well, there are a few usual suspects. They split broadly across a few categories, I would say. You've got the politics parties, then you have the fashion parties, then you have the art parties. And all of them have relative hierarchies. In the world of politics, I'd suppose the apex would be the Spectator Summer Party, which is happening this year, the week after the election. It was due actually for the 3rd of July. And then obviously Rishi Sunak made his surprise announcement and sort of gazumped them a bit by putting polling day on the 4th. People don't tend to go to parties the night before or the day before the election. So it's been moved over now to the week following polling day, so that might be a bit of a staging ground for the Conservative Party leadership election. Various people turn up to the Spectator Party, obviously the politicians, journalists, also public figures, actors, people who have written for the magazine. It's sort of a place to be.
And what about in fashion and the arts? These are also some very popular hot tickets.
In the arts world, I suppose at the top of the pile you'd probably have the Serpentine Party. This is where they open their new pavilion every year, which is designed by a major world-famous prize-winning artist. It tends to be very international. Nile Rodgers has turned up before, Diane Kruger, and also famously Princess Diana, who wore her black revenge dress. She was photographed coming out of her car wearing that back in the 90s, following her split from Prince, now King Charles. Then the V&A Party, that's sort of a big event on the fashion calendar. It happens in the gardens of the museum in South Kensington. It combines, strangely perhaps, a very civilised champagne reception with major figures in the art and fashion world, with a bit of a pop concert. Last year we were in the middle of sipping our champagne, and then the Sugar Babes appeared in the pond of the museum and performed a few songs, which some found exciting, others I think they were slightly confused.
Is it possible for us mere mortals to wangle an invite, or is it strictly watertight, guest list only?
The Evening Standard would not recommend gate crashing, but it is possible, and sometimes if you're in my trade of diary reporting necessary. It's something of a tradition for certain parties. I mean, I know, for example, of one person who's now working at the top of number 10 Downing Street, who in his younger days dressed up as a server to get into the champagne party and try to talk to the various politicians and influential people there. They had a small problem with that plan, of course, which is that nobody wants to really talk to a server at these kind of parties. Then in terms of the arts and fashion parties, I mean, the guest lists are fairly tight and the security the same, mainly because there are so many famous people there. And also, if you're holding it in a museum, you want to keep an eye on the various expensive exhibits and antiquities on display.
And aside from the rather frowned upon gate crashing, there is the more gentle art of mingling. Maybe for the more reserved person, perhaps, who's getting out and about again after COVID. How do we mingle?
Rule number one of all social mingling, and also I suppose networking, that rather odd word that people now use, is never apologise and never say sorry. I've noticed that people have this terrible habit of coming up to you at parties and saying, "Oh, sorry, I think we may have met at this thing." It's always a terrible mistake to put yourself on the back foot immediately and make yourself seem like the sort of inferior being. You've got to say, "Oh, we met at this thing, it's so good to see you again. Remember when we spoke about this?" I think that's far more likely to get a good response. Also, I mean, yes, there will be very famous people at these various summer parties, but most people are approachable unless they're complete egomaniacs. And also, at many parties, you find that people fail to properly coordinate their arrivals. I mean, I've seen, major sort of A-list television names, TV presenters and the like, turn up to parties when obviously they've got no friends there, and they stand in a corner by the bar, obviously at a loose end, and it's a great way to sort of meet somebody you might not ordinarily meet. Just go up to them and say hello. We're all equal, I like to think.
There's much more on these stories in Evening Standard newspaper and online at standard.co.uk. We're back on Wednesday at 4 p.m.